So with that, I will pass the microphone over to Dr. Kathleen Mannion to help get us situated and started our presentation today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Selena. Welcome, everyone. It is so fantastic to have you here. As Selena said, my name is Kathleen Mannion, and I'm an associate professor here at Royal Roads University. And it's just a beautiful day here, and I'm so excited for this important conversation that really delves into how we can best work across generations to tackle any wicked problem, but in particular, furthering our climate justice work around the world. I feel incredibly grateful to have Royal Roads University and the International Institute of Child Rights and Development host this dialogue. Both organizations acknowledge that they are situated here in the beautiful traditional lands of the families and ancestors of the Ksopsin and Algonquin peoples. As a visitor to these lands, I'm grateful for the stewardship of the lands that the ancestors and families have done in the past. And I continue to look to our Indigenous friends and colleagues to listen to their wisdom about how we can carry on shepherding these lands into the future. And I also invite you to acknowledge the lands where you are situated right now. And if you wish, please share those in the chat function. In today's session, we're looking at how to best support all of our lands across the planet in this session. But this session represents the third in a series of webinars looking at children and climate justice that have been hosted by the Royal Roads Graduate Certificate in Transforming Child Protection to Wellbeing alongside the International Institute of Child Rights and Development. And these have corresponded with the Phoenix Consultation, which was the North American Consultation for a Child's Right to a Healthy Environment, hence the title today. In this session, we're particularly looking at those lessons learned from working intergenerationally with children and older people. But I just want to flag before we get started that the first two webinars in the series, the first one started in April 2021 with Our Children's Trust, ICRD and Royal Roads University, and the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, which we looked at the legal aspects of climate change and why getting the climate science right in court is crucial to protect kids' rights. The second one we hosted was in June 2021, which was entitled Climate Change and Structural Violence Against Children. So more looking at a social science perspective. And this time we're really looking more at the relationality, looking at the relationships we hold with one another to make this important work come to life. I'm going to pop those YouTube links into the chat function once I'm done speaking. So if anyone wants to catch up on those, they can. But without further ado, I really want to thank my wonderful colleagues for agreeing to share their insights today. And I want to introduce a spectacular human being and a really effective young climate activist, Albert Lalonde, who has graciously agreed to be our MC for our session today, as he very ably did within the Phoenix Consultation. So with that, I hand over to you, Albert.
Hi, thank you so much, Kathleen. It's great to be with you, everyone. So my name is Albert Lalonde. I'm a climate and social justice activist here in Tiohtià:ke, Mouniang, which is also known as Montreal in so-called Quebec, on the unceded land of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. And yes, I'm also a law student and a communications and mobilization consultant at the David Suzuki Foundation. So today will be an opportunity to, I think, we talk a lot about intergenerational work, and it's sometimes a bit vague. And I think that, there's just this, we value intergenerationality as a concept, but it also implies some more difficult conversations. It implies some tensions just in the ways we're socialized, in the ways our societies are built. So I just think that it's going to be a great opportunity to speak more deeply about it, and also center youth perspectives and lived experience of people from different generations, which I suppose is really crucial in this work. It's also going to be an opportunity to speak to a concrete example of intergenerational collaboration with the Phoenix Consultation that for me was really an interesting opportunity. I wasn't even familiar with the child rights framework prior to that. I was just doing youth empowerment in my everyday life, and I think that it's really a lens that is so important in terms of really achieving social justice. And I'll speak a bit to that. I'll speak to that a little bit later. So today I'll introduce the agenda a little bit. So part one will consist in the framing of the webinar topic. So what does an intergenerational approach to children's right to a healthy environment even mean? So we'll talk about that with Professor Jessica Taft, who's a professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who will provide us with a bit of context on intergenerational work. Then we'll have the incredible Simran Sarwara, administrative assistant at the International Institute for Child Rights and Development and student at Simon Fraser University, and Rebecca Nellims, who is an associate faculty at Royal Roads University, and they will both share their work within the consultation and introduce the Phoenix Consultation so that everyone has enough context to follow the discussions that will follow. So part two will be the occasion to highlight key tensions that emerge in the consultation, and that will help us really grapple with the reality of working intergenerationally. So we'll have first Silvia Jocelyn Hernandez Basurto, who is a member of the Intergenerational Advisor Committee in the Phoenix Consultation and project manager at NAJ Hub, which is a youth-led civil society association. And she will start us off by looking at the issues for young people fighting for climate justice in Mexico. Then we'll have William Myers, which is a scholar, a longtime friend of the ICRD and an elder in the Phoenix Consultation, who will discuss the role of adult receptivity to youth activism. William will be followed by Vanessa Curie, who is the executive director of ICRD, who will then look at issues that emerge from funding for funding meaningful intergenerational work within NGOs or NGOs. She'll be followed by Martha Pitcher, who is an ICRD intern and student at Mount Allison University, who will talk about how to tackle eco-anxiety and climate justice work. And later I'll have the chance to touch a few words about the implications of the structural exclusion of youth from power. That will be followed by a third period during which the floor will be yours. So we'll go into breakout rooms, and you will have the occasion to discuss directly with every speaker, so you can address your questions. I think it will be really interesting to have an open discussion that we will then summarize during a short plenary session, and we will conclude today's webinar with a Q&A session. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Jessica Taft, who will tell us a bit more about the current debates on participation, meaningful participation, which is always a very important nuance to bring, and intergenerational partnership work.
Super. Thank you so much, Albert. It's really great to be here with all of you. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit by thinking about different ways that folks have talked about child participation and what some of the kind of current issues are in the field. And so the child participation field really frequently distinguishes between three types of participation. Consultative participation, which usually describes a process where adults seek children's views, recognizing that they have expertise and perspectives which need to inform adult decision-making, but it's ultimately a process that's led and directed by adults. Child-led participation, on the other hand, which describes those projects and processes where children themselves are identifying the issues that matter to them and then initiating and leading activities to address those issues, where adults' role here really is just to support children as they pursue their own objectives and agendas. And then finally, collaborative participation, a term that's used to describe the space sort of in between, where children and adults are both shaping the participatory process and its outcomes. And over the past few years, collaborative participation has really been held up as an especially ideal form of participation by a kind of growing number of child rights scholars and practitioners. And at the same time, in only somewhat overlapping circles, there's been a growing interest in the idea of intergenerational activism, with more adults asking how can they work alongside young people in the pursuit of justice. Now, both of these approaches, intergenerational activism and collaborative participation, emphasize the value of multiple age groups working together as partners in pursuit of shared goals. But collaboration and partnership are actually pretty fuzzy terms, right? They can be used to describe a whole diverse array of interactions and ways of relating to one another. In some cases, people use this language to refer to essentially child or youth-driven activities where adults are really just providing some support and maybe occasionally giving their input when asked. In other instances, it may describe a primarily adult-imagined project with adults providing political education on a topic and then asking young people to determine the actions that they might want to take in response to their collective engagement with that topic. Or it might describe a space where there's no official distinction between the roles and responsibilities of children, youth, and adults, but where informal hierarchies based on age or other social differences really still operate to give some people, usually older people, more influence and authority than others. In short, simply saying something is a partnership doesn't actually tell us very much about the formal and informal roles, responsibilities, and power dynamics that are at play. And in the case of intergenerational partnerships, one of the fundamental power dynamics that's always at play is adultism, a term that we use to talk about the systemic discrimination against young people. And adultism, as a social system of inequality, is simultaneously structural and cultural. And that means that it's structural in the sense that institutions and laws are really organized to give adults substantially more power and authority than young people, and also significant power over young people. And it's cultural in the sense that we have a variety of beliefs and attitudes that also position adults as better, more knowledgeable, more expert than young people. And then most importantly for our conversation today, adultism doesn't disappear just because we say we want to do intergenerational partnerships. In fact, because we live in an adultist society, the idea of intergenerational collaboration, as opposed to, say, taking an explicitly child or youth-led approach, can actually also sometimes allow for a continuation of adult domination. And even adults with the very best of intentions, adults who are deeply committed to young people's voice, rights, and power, adults who are aware of the problems of adultism, can still end up replicating adultist behaviors and modes of interaction. And there are also very real systemic and institutional constraints that can make it hard to displace adult power, whether this is related to how age structures our time and our availability for things, our access to particular kinds of resources, or the ability to enter certain institutional spaces easily. Adultism basically creates deep structures of inequality that are hard to just shake off just because we want to. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, right? It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to create more egalitarian partnerships that actually transfer more power to young people. And one key element of this then is critical reflection and discussion. Unfortunately, there's also a fair bit of hesitancy to really talk openly about the complex power relations that actually exist between young people and older generations. And I think there are several reasons for this, but one of them is the ever-present threat of the accusation of manipulation. Children in particular can be described by their political opponents as being pawns who are being used by adults. So in response, adult allies of young people sometimes bend over backwards to instead make the case that young activists are autonomous, they're in charge, they're doing it all their own, there's no adult influence at all. And this really profoundly impoverishes our collective ability to actually talk about how age-based power works. When adults are constantly trying to avoid the accusation of using youth, they're forced to deny their contributions rather than engaging in a more careful and critical discussion of their power within intergenerational social movement contexts. And so the reflections you'll hear today, I think, are a really refreshing an absolutely necessary response to this too frequent silence about age-based power dynamics. They're going to invite us to look beyond the label of collaborative participation and intergenerational partnership and ask, what do these words actually mean? What are some of the challenges to these partnerships? What are the different responsibilities and relationships being imagined and enacted? How's power operating in our collaboration? And especially, how can we build more horizontal intergenerational partnerships when the world that we live in continues to value the voices and perspectives of adults over those of children and youth? And so now I'm really pleased to hand things off to Simran and Rebecca. We're going to share a bit more about the particular intergenerational initiative that gives us an opportunity to reflect on these issues today.
Thank you so much, Jessica. My name is Rebecca. I go by the pronouns she, her, and I am joining you from the beautiful ancestral lands of the Lekwungen and the Kosopson families, where Royal Roads University is also based. And it's my role, and then I'll be passing off to Simran to just explain a little bit about the context of the Phoenix Consultation and some of the key components of it as an orientation for today's session. So as a starting point, as we know, young people have been absolutely in the forefront, leading the way around the world, making the strong and very clear connection between climate change and children's rights. And in response to this and recognizing this, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment decided to focus on the rights of children and youth to a healthy environment. And one of the approaches taken to this was to have a series of regional consultations organized around the world to hear directly from young people on this topic. So the Phoenix Consultation was the North American Consultation, or Turtle Island, as many Indigenous communities refer to it, including Mexico, Canada, and the US. And given the timing of this consultation in the wake of COVID-19, this was the first virtual consultation of all of the consultations to take place. So each of these consultations has been organized by the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative in collaboration with organizations specific or local to each of the regions. So on Turtle Island, this included a number of actors, which you'll see on the next slide, which shows the stakeholders. On the bottom left quadrant, you see a number of actors that were involved as institutional, interinstitutional collaborators in this project, which included a number of organizations, and we can follow up with details on them later for all of you. However, what I wanted to point out with this slide and point your attention to in particular was that another unique feature of this consultation was its design as not just an interinstitutional collaboration, but a multi-sectoral and intergenerational collaboration and initiative. So in addition to the organizational institutions and sponsors that you see on the bottom two right quadrants and the tech partners, which are fairly standard components to consultations such as this, the event was also the results of months of planning with young people and intergenerational collaboratives as represented by the academic committee on the left-hand side of and the intergenerational advisory committee on the top right. The Intergenerational Advisory Committee, and we have Yoseline here who will be speaking later, it was consisted of 2 young people from each of the countries as well as an elder. And they were involved in overseeing all aspects and advising on all aspects of the consultation from the design phase through. And the academic committee was a network of children's rights and participatory researchers, many of whom engaged young people in advance of the consultation to conduct or build the capacity to conduct their own participatory research. And some of those young people presented that research and the results and findings of that research on the opening days of the consultation. The trilingual event itself was designed to support and facilitate intergenerational dialogue throughout, and as such generated many reflections and insights on this intergenerational collaboration and what this means. The majority of delegates were young people, the MCs and many of the speakers were young people, and the event had many participatory elements designed to center and elevate the voice and leadership of young people. So on the next slide, just see the cover page of the report, which provides an overview for the consultation, and we will share the link in the chat for you. And it highlights the key recommendations of the delegates that came out as coded by predominantly young people. And the other main document on the next slide you will see that came out of the consultation was called the Phoenix Manifesto. The text is a little too small for you to read here, but again, the link is in the chat to the Phoenix Manifesto. And the manifesto is a series of demands made by the delegates. And it was drafted in real time, led by young participants and people at the consultation, who then brought it back to the larger group in all 3 languages to get the input of the entire group to see that it actually reflected the dialogue and perspectives of the group. And without further ado, I would like to hand it off now to my amazing and inspiring colleague, Simran.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Selena, if you don't mind moving just quickly to the next slide here, wanted to have this great visual while I move into my piece. A common dynamic that I would argue many of us that are present here today are familiar with and struggle with is trying to shift out of a cyclical habit of recognizing there's a problem, saying we should do something about it, and then because of the breadth or the scope or the depth of what is required to address the problem, nothing happens. Part of the issue may lie with not knowing how to take such truly overwhelming and complex ideas and translating them into tangible, realistic actions that support sustainable momentum. And this was a sentiment that was echoed by many young folks at the consultation itself last year. And so to support addressing the gap that often exists between the what is and where we want to go, we also spent some time creating a resource to fill in the how, in addition to the report that Rebecca just spoke to. On the next slide here, you'll see just a screenshot of the Activating the Phoenix Manifesto Toolkit, which is an interactive activity resource informed by the demands reflected in the Phoenix Manifesto, and it intended to catalyze clear action planning based on the context of the person that is using the resource. In particular, it allows for intergenerational, cross-sectoral, like Rebecca was saying, collaboration, by inviting participants to move through what they already know and what they bring, what they want to do, and then breaking down how to get there. By following the prompts that are on the core toolkit cards, as well as the Phoenix Manifesto cards that are included in the toolkit, and guiding either an individual or a group through some critical reflection. It can be used individually to create self-action plans, as well as to bring together people with a range of lived experiences to co-create an action plan. We are in the process of completing this resource so that it can be readily shared, so please do let us know if you're interested in staying connected as that piece emerges. And while this resource and the Phoenix report are a testament to the ways in which intergenerational collaboration has profound implications, there were also several lessons learned that emerge from this process of putting the consultation together. And some of those lessons we would like to share with all of you today. So I'd love to just open the panel piece with focusing on looking at intergenerational collaboration using a critical anti-oppression lens. And Selena, for this piece, you're more than welcome to stop screen sharing unless you wanted to look at the pretty toolkit. But I did want to open by just inviting us to think back to what Dr. Taft opened with, and really bring back in that piece around adult-centric spaces where power is often concentrated. Within my lived experience, I would argue that there is an inherent problematic nature of trying to bring youth and children into something that already exists, often spaces that are created by and for adults, versus co-creating new spaces together right from the get-go, which might mean a deconstruction of older spaces. But it's not just the co-creating of those spaces, but co-creating the conditions for us to come together. In other words, how we will treat each other in these new spaces that we co-create. If we do not address the larger systemic pieces that prevent meaningful youth leadership from happening, it doesn't matter how many new spaces we will create, it will inevitably recreate the same ageist dynamics that we already see. I recognize that there is immediate value in the former approach of trying to bring youth and children into things that already exist. As Dr. Taft pointed out, it's common already, but as a long-term solution or idealizing this approach will prevent us from enacting meaningful shifts that go beyond the goals of the specific issue at hand. In other words, we're not just engaging youth as a means to an end to solve climate change, but we are engaging young people and centering their leadership because we recognize the inherent value that they have and the necessity to radically shift our understanding of their value in order to address the oppression that they have to navigate. Applying a critical lens that's rooted in anti-oppressive values means not just recognizing that barriers exist. I feel like we've all arrived to that point. We know things are present that are preventing young people from being in those spaces and taking power. And so it is not just the identification of the barriers, but the vehement opposition to attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that enable those barriers to continue. This is difficult, overwhelming, and very uncomfortable work that requires a commitment of reflexive, iterative actions on the part of adults. But it is precisely because of the nature of this work that helps demonstrates its necessity. What this means at the individual as well as collective level is a serious re-examination of internalized beliefs and ideas about youth leadership. And when you experience, because it will happen, when you experience resistance or tension in trying to shift your ideas, your attitudes, and your behaviors, committing to a confrontation of that tension, whether it is within yourself or what you witness among your peers, and authentically asking, what is it that you are so afraid of? I'd like to transition and pass it on to one of my lovely peers on the panel here, Yosalin, who was a co-host for the consultation last year, and invite her to speak to her lived experiences.
Hello. Thank you, Simon, for the presentation. I'm happy to be here with all of you, and thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, my name is Jocelyn Hernandez Basurto. I'm a member of the Intergenerational Advisory Committee and project manager in NAHUP ACE. My participation today is to give you a brief overview of environmental activism in Mexico and to highlight the work of the Phoenix Consultation with Mexican children and youth. Okay, in Mexico, more than a third of the population is under 29 years old, which means that a significant percentage of us are young people or children. That is one of the reasons why the Phoenix Consultation was so important for us. And I had the opportunity to visit different communities in my country, and I have enjoyed the beauty, but I have also witnessed and been victim of many inequalities on a social and an economic level. Inequalities that imminently lead to environmental and climate injustice. Mexican activists are being killed. Since I started to participate in environmental activism, I realized that I was not alone, that there were many people who maintained the same fight as me, but we also know that is not enough. There are still many voices that are not heard. And that is why initiatives like Phoenix Consultation are so important to start including all the voice of children and youth. A clear example is the children and youth who belong to rural communities. These communities are indispensable for the preservation of agrobiodiversity and the environment. Thanks to Phoenix Consultation, I had the opportunity to write an article in Sari's blog. The article is called Food Sovereignty Means Defending Our Right to a Healthy Environment. It is in Spanish and English. Well, For me, one of the most valuable things about this consultation was that I always felt included. I can say the same for my Mexican colleagues. Our ideas were always protected and our difference respected. Finally, I would like to end with Nahub's quote, and it's, "They taught us we could not change the world, but we will keep trying." Nos dijeron que no podíamos cambiar el mundo, pero seguiremos intentándolo. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. And now I'm pleased to introduce Bill, who will talk us about the life course perspective, an interesting topic. What a pleasure to have you here, Bill. And the microphone is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Elaine. My name is William, but call me by Bill, please. I want to say a few fairly strong things in a few minutes, and I'm not going to try to justify them. So if you wish, there is online a white paper in which I have put some materials that you can download and hopefully might be able to give you a little bit of some ideas of where I'm coming from. I'm going to talk about adult receptivity to youth and child activism, and focus specifically on the Manifesto and specifically on climate change, which is a kind of the heart issue of the broader environmental issue you took up here. And I want to say, first of all, that coming from a professional background of child protection, I've been among those who kind of thought for many years that just get those young people out there and get their voices out there and get them to say what they have to say, and everybody will pay attention to them. And I'm here to tell you that doesn't work. That is not happening. And if you watch Greta Thunberg, you know, there, or you take the people who talked in the consultation we're talking about here, that is very clear. And the problem is a little bit, in some ways, the way young people communicate, but that's not the seat of the problem. The seat of the problem is adult ignorance and resistance to what young people have to say. As Jessica has pointed out early on at the beginning, part of that is structural. It's about issues. There's absolute adult opposition from major sectors to things that you have to say here. And I'm going to let that for structural. That's going to be addressed separately. So I'm going to leave that out. The other side that was identified is what's called cultural. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm an octogenarian. I'm part of some of these elder groups, and I see how they operate. I share some of their faults. And so some of this also comes out of experience, but I also do some research on this. First of all, I think it's really important to understand that adults have a huge problem with showing empathy to people and to children beyond their own immediate family or community circle. Empathy across distances of time and space is difficult, okay? So one of the things that's working here are some aspects of human psychology. Now, that gets tied up in culture. Some cultures are a lot worse at that than others. And I'm just going to say out loud, American culture, and I don't know if it's all North American or not, is specifically bad at this, okay? We really do a lousy job of reaching out and empathizing with the young in a lot of these issues, okay? The second thing is going on is that there is a no question brought up by both young and old that anybody over about 50 years old has known about the climate change and its problems all of their adult life. Basically, the country is full of, I'm going to say elder people, I'm going to go that group, who have been fully apprised, okay, of what's going on and have chosen not to make it an issue, but have chosen to live in comfort, okay, their own way, and knowing perfectly well knowing that this stuff was backing up, you know, for the young to come, okay? There is no good excuse for that. So some psychologists have been looking, say, what the heck's going on here? That's unnatural. And as they burrowed into this. They found the limits of empathy that I mentioned. I'm not going to go into details about that. And they also have found guilt complexes and things like that. People who know down deep that they help cause the problem want to jump in and, you know, and solve it, okay? Or they want to ignore it, but they don't want to get too close to the young who raise these problems. Now, this all gets extremely murky. I'm not going to go in depths of it, but I'm just going to point out this is a major issue, and it's something that people working in child protection, for example, and something that youth need to take in mind because they are going up against a wall. Okay, so there are places in that have happened. Now, a few years ago, youth and ICRD and the David Suzuki Foundation together worked in a workshop in San Francisco as part of the Global Climate Summit, okay, in which they together thought, what are kind of the areas of action that we ought to be working together on? And they came up with 4, which were, I'm going to call them the 4 Ps. The first one is protection. Obviously, you can think about adults getting involved in protection for the very young, but how about protection for youth who are now come under oppression, you know, and, you know, for example, from authorities or from others, you know, who really oppose them, okay? How should we be doing about that? And that, you adults don't just step and do that. That's something that has to be negotiated, okay? The second P is preparation. Obviously, we have a job to prepare the young to know what's coming up. And you think right away of classes on climate change and its effects and so forth. But how about the mentoring and reaching out to the young to help them understand and acquire the social context, the skills, the personal abilities and so on that are needed in order to represent themselves and their ideas? That comes through a broader part of society, and that's something that has to be negotiated with old and young working together. The third P is participation. This way, the older people have to step in because they detain the power. They have the locks on the doors to power. And if doors are going to be open to invite the young in, the adult population has to really take an active role in opening those doors. But again, that's something that needs to be discussed and worked out with the people who are going to go through those doors. The fourth P is promotion. It's promotion of children's and youth's own best interests and their ideas, their own ideas, their own goals, their own priorities, and stand behind them and support them and help the young people into leadership, and then follow that leadership when they're there. Folks, there is a huge, huge problem here. It ain't happening. And there are various reasons, as I've mentioned, to come before. One is the problem of empathy, so on. But there's something else going on here. In my country, there's an organization of elders, okay? There are plenty of them. We're working on climate change, you know, and we have good old, I call it boomer culture, okay? You get out there and give me the activist, and now we caused the problem, now we're going to save the world from the problem we caused. And nobody else gets invited into that. Now, why? What can be done about that? And some people are asking about that because that is a real problem. And young people with the trying to push the elements of the manifesto are going to come up against it. 3 things. First of all, there's some indication that actually getting people together and working, you know, and talking together in some kind of action together is helpful. It's not easy. Okay, I completely go along with Jessica saying there's skills involved, that takes training and so on. It's possible, but it has to be worked on. Okay. A second and very interesting, I think, suggestion coming up. It's been around for about 15 or 20 years maybe, but it's really kind of catching on now. And that is, we should work together across generations to get out of short-termism, which is causing a lot of the problems, okay? And together plug and adopt a long-term value. And they're hanging a sign on this. They're calling it becoming good ancestors. There are other ways you can look at that. But all of us should become good ancestors. First, people my age, we're there now, okay? But young people coming up in their own time have to become good ancestors too. How do we, as a society, individually, and corporately and in governance, how do we become good ancestors? What does good ancestor look like? And there are those, and they go in my white paper, and I give you some references. There are people having some very interesting discussions about that. Third, I want to put my own in here, that I think we have to apply love. Now, we get very programmatic about these things. We say, you know, we're going to have a program for this, a program for that. Folks, how we love each other, and especially how we older people love our young, is right smack dab in the middle of this. And we have to love our young, not just, you know, for their birthdays, you know, our own grandkids, stuff like that. But we have to love our young broader and longer, and we have to extend that to more people than just the ones we know. And I think there are ways of working on that. They're well known and so on. But some of us are going to have to get love in there. And I think that young people have every right to talk to us about the structural opposition you have, about our cultural, you know, resistance, see, and about really what we mean by love and how we make it operational. We can talk more in the breakout group if you like. Thanks. And I'm going to pass it on now to Vanessa. Vanessa came up through ICRD, which for many years has been a pioneer in community level intergenerational work to protect young people. And she's been there from the beginning of that, and is now the executive director of ICRD, and brings a lot of experience to that. Vanessa, would you take over, please?
Thanks so much, Bill. Bill has been an amazing mentor for me over the last few years. So it's really been a pleasure to work in that intergenerational partnership with you, Bill. So I'm going to take a slightly different spin on our talk around sort of challenges of intergenerational partnerships to talk about how we resource or how we don't these intergenerational partnerships. The IICRD, the International Institute for Child Rights and Development, is a Canadian charity that focuses on leading with children to transform the world. And we're looking at how we bring innovation and change to what in child rights language is called meaningful participation of children and young people. And this is really paramount to our team. At IICRD, we're really keen to explore how we move from participation of young people to partnership with young people. And this distinction, as everyone has alluded to already in our talk today, fundamentally changes the way this work is done. It means that young people are present throughout any process that is undergoing as collaborators with an equal or even a more weighted voice. It means that we're finding spaces for young people to have their ideas heard and to have influence on decisions and actions being taken. It's about partnership throughout. And so when we think about how do we actually bring this forward into the world, how do we action this, we have to think about what funding and what resources are available to support teams who are keen to do this. And unfortunately, the system is not currently designed to support intergenerational partnerships. And I'm just going to share two really concrete examples that emerged from the Phoenix Consultation for your consideration. The first, and sort of building on what Bill was saying, is that partnership requires relationships. It requires love, and relationships take time. They're not short-term, they're not one-offs. And the benefits of strong relationships support everyone involved, all ages, and they also support the outcome of the work. And structures of funding really need to move from being based on short-term projects to longer-term initiatives that really invest in these meaningful relationships between human beings and with the natural world. The second example is that the current environment of child and youth participation If you're lucky, there's funding to bring on young people as project advisors, or maybe to have a youth advisory council. But due weight really needs to be given to this transformational approach of partnering with young people. So in that sense, spaces are needed for young people and adults to co-create, to co-determine the outcomes of processes together, including where funding goes and how you learn from these efforts, how you may struggle, and how you might have the opportunities to try again. These opportunities are not currently available for intergenerational teams, though they may exist in other spaces that you can think of, like startup companies and other business spaces. We need to think about how we're bringing these kinds of opportunities for innovation into the child rights sphere, where they currently do not exist. So opening our eyes to the benefit of intergenerational partnerships, which I think we saw so much of that opportunity at the Phoenix Consultation and in some of our other work, creates this opportunity for growth that offers all involved the potential to transform the way we work, the way that we're doing the work. Having everyone at the table and ensuring that all voices are heard means that we can increase the pace of change. And when we're talking about climate change, we really have no time to waste. And so I encourage everyone to think critically about how we can bring intergenerational partnerships into our work. Thank you. And now I'm going to have the pleasure to introduce Martha Petra. Martha has been an incredible intern at ICRD for the past year and has fed deeply into the Phoenix Consultation since basically day one. So excited to turn it over to you, Martha.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. So what I'm going to talk about today, for the most part, is based on my experience with the Phoenix Consultation, also in the process of creating the Phoenix report, and all the data that emerged from that. So what I'm going to do today is sort of pick out one key theme that I think is not brought to these tables very often, and that I think we should talk more about, and that's eco-anxiety. So as someone who grew up in a coastal community, and most of my family lives on the equator, eco-anxiety is something, unfortunately, that I'm very familiar with. So at the consultation, there are many young people that expressed worry, anxiety, and grief surrounding the climate crisis. So one young person spoke about their fear about having children in the face of climate shocks. Many others urged that eco-anxiety should be recognized as a real problem, especially for young people in communities that are most immediately affected. So the eco-anxiety that myself and many of the young people at the consultation share is not unique. There is a substantial amount of research that supports the idea that this is a problem faced by children and young people all around the world in much larger numbers than we might expect. So from the literature, we find that many young people share a deep worry about future generations, about our livelihoods, and about the perceived lack of response to climate change. So responses to eco-anxiety include feelings of helplessness, panic, rumination on feelings of guilt and worry, disturbed sleep, and poor concentration. So even in my immediate peer groups, and that's primarily folks between the ages of 18 and 25, these are feelings really commonly shared and that we talk fairly openly about on a regular basis. So I would argue that these responses to the climate crisis are not overreactions, rather they're entirely rational given the scope of the problem. So perceptions of and experiences with the climate crisis can be traumatic and scary, and we need to start creating space for that psychological reality across generations and across sectors. It's really imperative that we not only acknowledge and name the problem of eco-anxiety, but we also need to make mental health services available with this particular challenge in mind. Because we can't afford for young climate activists to burn out, and we are seeing this right now. And at the same time, we can't place the entire burden of the climate crisis on them. It's not enough to provide networks of mental health support for young people facing eco-anxiety. There also has to be a sense that we're not alone in this, and the onus isn't only on us to take action. So with that, I'm really excited to reintroduce the next speaker, who's a passionate climate activist and one of our Phoenix Consultation MCs. They're also just a wonderful person. So Albert will be talking to us today about youth and structural exclusion.
Thank you so much, Martha, and thank you for your important words and your amazing presence in this whole process. You're amazing yourself. I'm going to speak a little bit to structural exclusion of youth and mostly to its implications in terms of social reproduction. And really, I think it's important to see, you know, in like giving actual decision-making power to youth is just a necessary step in the fight for any kind of social justice. And that's how I think it's important to read. I think that's how our analysis should sort of be structured. And then I'll also touch a few words on perspectives in building power and how youth power is inherently disruptive, maybe to echo Simran. So you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So this is just a very quick diagnosis of how, you know, the structural exclusion of youth is a democratic failure, because if we start from the point of view that youth are actual citizens, like, you know, the city in its the Greek root of like the word city is the place, the space where decisions are made. And so if you look at this, like a kindergarten classroom is a city and children are citizens, because just by, you know, everyone by just existing has an inherent intrinsical capacity to bring change. And it can be in some very small details, but like children have opinions and they voice them, and every single member of the community of the classroom will express their opinions and will be a citizen in that sense. And so if you start with that premise that well, children are actual people and that their voice matters, which I think is not much to ask, then, you know, it has to be regarded as a problem that youth, for example, are excluded from elected positions. So there's like an age that is set to vote, and there's perhaps reasons to that I'm not really interested in discussing. But still, like, you know, who gets elected prior to 30 years old? Youth, my generation is like the poorest in the history of well, colonial Canada. Youth are excluded from electoral platform. You know, it's all about like jobs, and it's a lot about jobs for older people and jobs for you know, but they're at the end of the day, or it's about retirement. Like, how often do we talk about retirement policies during the elections? And that's very valid. Like, this is so important. And I think that if we look at it, it's another discussion, but if we look at it, the mechanisms that exclude elders are much of the same that exclude children. But still, like, youth do not have this decisional power. And when we look at the media, like, this is a curve of the voting rate of young people by generation in Canada. And what we see is that, you know, young people are always sort of blamed for not voting and not using the mechanisms that are there for them to, you know, have some power or voice their concerns. But it's just, I think it's just symptomatic of the fact that young people don't even see themselves or their interests represented in the elective system. So, you know, I think we often have this sort of, you know, very, I don't know, liberal has like a different sense in French than in English and in the United States, but there's just this very, this vision that's really associated to liberalism in terms of, oh, it's your fault that you're not, you are like earning power and earning money and earning positions and through work, and this sort of myth that it's the youth's responsibility to vote in a system that doesn't even work and that is unable to defend their own interests, I think is very problematic and has to be deconstructed in many instances. And yeah, overall, I think this is all rooted in some cultural, a lot of cultural reasons. You can pass on to the next slide. So I think it's important to regard youth exclusion as a very strong social reproduction mechanism, because all of what I said is true, but it's very it's true to very different extents. So just like youth, it's not true that youth don't get elected positions prior to the age of 30, but it's just very privileged youth that tend to be able to access power while young. And this whole social inequalities, youth are also more vulnerable to social inequalities because they depend so much on their family. And this whole, I don't know, like we can debate whether there is a social elevator or not, but youth are where are completely tributary of where they're born. And so there's just this idea that whether it's in language development, whether it's in all those things, and again, we can also challenge the fact that people should reach a certain level of language that corresponds to a certain social class, but there's all of those facts that are just so deeply, it just creates so much difference. And so just this idea that early access to institutional power is so decisive and defining, and the more early we have power, the more easily the more early we're also able to defend our own interests. And when we acquire power and money and those things, then it's just much easier to keep accumulating it and keep gaining power and keep gaining capital. And so it's just so important, I think, in sociological terms, to really consider that, really question what we actually value. So, in terms of just, I think that just this idea of separating, for example, the professional relationships that we have from the personal relationships that we have is so deeply, it really makes a lot of youth have a hard time in feeling comfortable in spaces that are political or in spaces that are associated with power. So just I think it's really about questioning our whole framework of what we value, what language we have to use in order for our words to be valid, is just one example. But so it's really about a vision of the world. And I think that then we also have to think of education as a systemic enabler. So for example, we learn so much of what we learn in school is about obedience, but how much is obedience even worth learning? And does the world need more obedient people? I don't think so. And you can pass on to the next slide, and I will conclude briefly. Sorry for going slightly over time. But so, this premise can only lead us to considering that, youth have to build power somehow. And there's just this clock that is ticking now, but I think that all fights for social justice are existential. TGLBQ plus fights are existential for TGLBQ people. Anti-racism is vital for racialized people, and it's just and so this sort of spirit of emergency that we feel for climate is something that people that are marginalized feel in their everyday life, and that's very concrete in sort of a very similar sense. Well, I think, and so there's just this, youth have to build power, and to acquire, they need to gain power the ways that are available. And if the institutions don't make room, don't make space for youth, then there's just this existential need to create space and to build their own power. And, if it doesn't go through the institutions, then it's going to go against the institutions. And so there's just this, when working with youth, there's also this this necessity to acknowledge that the solution is often just completely outside the frame that is defined, and often it comes with disturbing, and it comes with I think, and a lot of the times I feel like when, you know, in spaces of intergenerational work, when there's confrontation, it's also like it should also be a metric of success, honestly, because it means that youth feel confident enough to feel like they can even like at least try to shape the space in a way that suits them. So I think that this is, for instance, a success. So I think that I just threw a lot of big ideas, and now I will let Kathleen explain us how the breakout rooms are going to work.
Thank you so much, Albert. Well, what a fantastic group of speakers. Thank you so much for sharing this with us and then posing some of these really crucial tensions. So it's great that we say, yes, let's make sure that we are working intergenerationally, and that we're focusing on meaningful participation, but recognizing that there are a lot of things that sit below that and a lot of tensions that we need to navigate. As Simran said, commit to confront some of that resistance. At this time, we're going to break into breakout groups, and we're going to give you the option to go where you want to, where you feel you want to further unpack some of this. We're going to have about 15 minutes to do this. 13 to 15 minutes to do this. There's 5 different groups. We're going to have one looking at anti-oppression and intergenerationality, adult receptivity, resourcing intergenerational partnerships, eco-anxiety, and structural exclusion of youth from power. We also have a Padlet that you can start to share some of your ideas in the Padlet that you're gathering, you're talking about within those breakout groups. Selena, maybe you could just pull up the Padlet just in case it's new to people. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So if you're not familiar with it, you're just simply gonna, she's got her arrow on it. You're gonna simply add that little plus button there, and you can add a thought there, type it in, add a picture, whatever you want. We're gonna come back after about 13 to 15 minutes and then have a little bit of a debrief. And I wish you a really fantastic conversation. You should have something coming up on your screen inviting you into whichever breakout room is calling to you. Have a great conversation, everyone.
Welcome back, everyone. Seems like everyone made the very best out of their last minute, so that's great. And now we would like to follow with a short plenary. So if you'd like, there's only 10 minutes left too. So I think we can just go with the flow and sort of mix. If you'd like to summarize what was said in the breakout rooms, that would be fantastic. If you would like to ask questions, specific questions to any of the panelists, I think that is also a good moment to do it. And I think that, yeah, you can also leave your questions in the chat. And even though we're not able to answer everything, it will definitely be interesting to get your feedback for the next steps. So I don't know if anyone would like to summarize what happened in the rooms, or if anyone has some questions that they would really like to have answers to. You can either raise your hands or ask them directly in the chat.
And also just to pop in there, Albert, as well, we also have the Padlet, and the link is in the chat function. If you want to jot some of your ideas down there, if you're feeling a little quieter, you can certainly do that there too. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Palette has this function where you can also, like, I don't know, you can, I think you can put like little signs of appreciation onto the notes. I don't know if it's activated now. It doesn't seem like it, but I think it's always interesting to see what is more cohesive in terms of ideas. Don't be shy, everyone. Oh, thanks, Rebecca, for activating that function. But yeah, would anyone like to comment anything? How did this resonate? I am sure there were some really interesting conversations in the breakouts. Would someone from the anti-oppression breakout perhaps like to share what was said?
I'll quickly chime in and say that I think the person that we had in our group got cut off mid-sharing, but Jessica or Dr. Taft provided a great question that sort of led to the sharing that I've just put into the Padlet here to think about that there is a difference between this movement around intergenerational collaboration and addressing ageism faced by young people. That in itself is sort of this reflective of some kind of anti-oppressive efforts, and it at the same time it's distinct from other anti-oppressive movements. There is a difference of some kind. So we were starting to get to a point of what are those differences between those movements and where are there similarities, and perhaps are there learnings from these different movements that can help inform intergenerational collaboration. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Would anyone like to summarize what was said about adult receptivity, perhaps? I think that one is one that I'm especially curious about as a young person.
Which one are you asking about?
The room about your presentation, William.
We basically just asked the question and didn't have any answers. Is how do you wake older people up? How do you get them to see the bigger picture?
Yes, it's definitely difficult to find answers to such broad interrogations in such little time. With someone, is there maybe like one last question that you would like to, that someone would like to share, or that someone would like to ask, or you can keep filling the Padlet. In terms of resourcing partnerships, I think this is always really decisive, whether we like it or not. So in that regard, Troom, what was, would anyone like to tell us what was said?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conclusion really is that it's difficult. It's difficult to resource, and we need to shift a lot of the ways that we're funding, you know, the social justice or environmental justice movement generally, but then also looking at specifically intergenerational partnerships or the engagement of young people. So recognizing that it's a bigger challenge than just this, I think was one of the comments. And then just kind of we reflected on our own processes when we were younger and feeling the same challenges, and recognizing that not a lot has changed in the 20 plus years since those of us who were adults have grown up. Thanks, Albert.
Thank you, Vanessa. So I'm reading in the chat that people who are not assigned as panelists are not able to open their mics, unfortunately. So would you perhaps, I think you can ask your questions in the chat. I don't know if that can be sorted out for the 3 minutes that last, but maybe we can just listen to Martha about what was said in the breakout room about eco-anxiety. And then I can summarize a bit what we said, and then we can say each other goodbye and see you again. So Martha, would you like to go?
Sure. In our group, we talked about experiences with children and with young people about talking about the climate crisis and sort of the anxieties that arise around that, and how to speak about it as both rational and scary. And the question was raised about what role does the education system play in this, and what role does community play in this as well. So kind of like everyone else, not a ton of answers, but a lot of sharing and a lot of questions as well.
Thanks so much, Martha. Yeah, we spoke a little bit about, you know, it's good to identify the problem, which is mainly what I did in my presentation, but it's also very interesting to speak about the solutions. So how do we achieve power for the youth? So that's a big discussion. And we talked about like the relationship between grassroots and NGOs, and how, you know, this like NGOs are one of the only actors that have resources and some level of power, and that have the most freedom perhaps to help youth-led movements. But that also requires a lot of letting go and deconstruction and acceptance of chaos. So well, that's a whole other conversation that we could have the next time. So thank you everyone for joining. I think this webinar was definitely very, very interesting. I feel like we found more questions than we were able to state any answer, but it was very fertile, and I think it was very rich in terms of ideas. And I wish to really thank everyone who worked on organizing the webinar with the wonderful ICRD team. I think, you know, you've really been like remarkable people in my own experience. I think, you know, this whole experience with the Phoenix Consultation has really, well, marked me as an individual, and working with all of you, just keeping this conversation going, and we keep going further collectively, and it's just been so enriching. So on a personal level, I really wish to thank everyone. I wish to thank everyone who attended, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing such, I think we really achieved this sort of personal tone, and sharing this personal experience that's, you know, requires maybe more confidence building, but in the end that is so important, and that is, you know, has so much to do in terms of regarding also and listening to youth in an appropriate way, and just yeah, so I think it's just like a great start, and we will definitely be able to follow up on all of those questions. So this is so interesting, and I don't know, I feel like I'm gonna have a lot of thinking to do about everything that was said in this webinar, and I hope you do too. And I hope everyone has an amazing day. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, and thank you to all the panelists. Such a fantastic conversation. I really appreciated it. Thank you, Selena, for keeping us on track, and a huge thank you to Albert for moving us along and keeping this going. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.